Rome, an empire synonymous with longevity, peace, and adaptability, has inspired the historical mind for millennia. Perhaps the most asked question about Rome is whether the empire's collapse was inevitable. As such, it is a common thought experiment to question the problems that led to Rome's collapse and analyze whether these problems truly represented a perfect storm, or if it was the incompetence of contemporary Romans or the rot which had supposedly infected Roman society which doomed the empire. Now, as a Roman history addict who thinks about Rome on a daily basis, I have run this thought experiment many times in my head, probably too many times, far too many times, and I'm absolutely convinced that the collapse of the Roman Empire was in fact completely inevitable. In fact, I'm entirely convinced that it is miraculous that the Roman Empire lasted as long as it did. This argument will be the central focus of this video, and throughout it, I will go over the many factors which I believe doomed the Roman Empire. Now, I do need to make a couple of qualifying statements because this topic is rather complex, and there's no way I can cover it properly in a short video when entire volumes of books have proved insufficient. Firstly, I'm talking entirely about the Western Roman Empire's collapse in 476 AD. This video is not about the fall of Constantinople to the Turks. Also, this video is on military history, so all my points will be entirely militaristic in nature. Although I do admit that focusing only on the military is insufficient to form a proper argument on this topic, but I want to talk about what I find cool, so that's why I'm doing it this way. Now, my first point is kind of a retort of what the conventional wisdom about the fall of the Roman Empire is. You see, for a long time, people have argued that the Roman Empire collapsed because of a military stopped being Roman. It's this idea of the Germanization of the Roman Empire, of influx of foreigners, primarily foreigners that fought in the military, made the military disloyal and far less disciplined. Now, I fully believe that this point is utterly inaccurate. I mean, firstly, auxiliaries had been an important part of the Roman Empire for as long as it was an empire. I mean, auxiliaries were featured in virtually every single campaign. And who truly believes that foreign troops are disloyal? I mean, how many times have foreign troops been of central importance in military campaigns throughout history, let alone just Rome? So, did we want to focus on Rome's? Batavian auxiliaries were used in virtually every single successful amphibious assault that Rome launched. Greek auxiliaries featured prominently in the conquest of Macedon. Um, I mean, Italian auxiliaries were used extensively before the social wars. Virtually every single army that went up against Hannibal had tons of Italian auxiliaries in it. And I could just go on and on and on and on. Now, the reason why the late Roman army was extremely unreliable is because the auxiliary system fell apart. You see, when it came to auxiliaries, an auxiliary unit was typically led by a Roman commander. The people serving in the auxiliary unit would be doing so in order to obtain Roman citizenship at the end of perhaps 20 years or something like that. I don't know the exact year limit, but once their military service was done, they'd reap the rewards of Roman citizenship. And also, they wouldn't be in a unit of their neighbors, of their tribe, if that makes any sense. Like, the Romans were very, very good at appropriating people into their empire because they'd take a group of people and then they would kind of separate them. That way, their existing tribal structures would break apart, and when those people were incorporated into an auxiliary unit, that tribal structure would not be in place. But that all stopped after the Battle of Adrianople, when the Romans lost to a Visigothic army. You see, after that loss, the Visigoths were able to dictate their own terms in which they settled in Roman land, which meant that the Visigoths were able to basically go as an entire tribe into Roman territory and settle. And when those same Visigoths would later fight in the Roman army, that social structure, that tribal structure, that hierarchy would stay in place within the army so that the soldiers would then be loyal to their chiefs, to their leaders, rather than to the Roman commanders. And that created a fundamental problem because, of course, people would be loyal to their chiefs, to their family, to their people, rather than their Roman superiors. So if the Roman army maintained its old auxiliary structure, this whole foreign presence in the Roman army wouldn't have meant anything. But because they didn't, then it meant everything. But yet, this idea is sold as if merely the presence of foreigners had doomed the Roman army to become a far less capable fighting force. And this is far from the truth. My next point is that Rome's enemies simply got stronger. Now, I don't want to claim that Rome's enemies are original foes, the civilizations that they dispatched during the height period of a republic were bad. No, no, they were excellent foes, from the Macedonians to the Seleucids to the Carthaginians. They were strong fighting forces, but they were all unequivocally weaker and lesser than that of the Roman Empire. I mean, think about Rome's classic enemies. Say the Carthaginians. I mean, despite having the able command of Hannibal leading them in the Second Punic War, their army was just far inferior to that of Rome's. They're not culturally or linguistically homogenous, as in half the army was like Libyan or Numidian or Gallic or Iberian. They're composed of a smattering of different people that would have had a lot of trouble communicating with each other properly. And if this creates a humongous problem in the heat of the battlefield where, orders need to be relayed and obeyed with quick precision. And otherwise, I mean, these troops are not uniformly equipped. Not at all. I mean, I think Roman troops would have been far better equipped than any Carthaginian army, regardless of period or commander. And hoplites proved to be so vastly inferior to Roman style infantry that Hannibal just simply copied Roman arms, at least to the best of his ability, although he could only really loot the Roman dead rather than equip his forces fresh. So, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to state here is that all of these armies, either through fighting style, numbers, or equipment, were inferior to that of the Romans. I mean, think about the Gauls when Julius Caesar invaded Gaul. They didn't have the level of equipment, training, or discipline that the Romans had. Neither did the Britons when Claudius invaded Britain. Regardless of which foe the Romans faced, they were vastly inferior. I mean, when it comes to the barbaric enemies typical of Rome's most expansionist years, I mean, I think the Battle of Watling Street, when Aulus not Aulus Claudius, I was about to give the wrong name, but when Suetonius beat Boudica, hands down. I mean, he did it while utterly outnumbered by like a factor of probably 6 or 7. So, simply put, these enemies were far weaker than the late enemies of the empire, which consisted of the Huns, more or less a precursor to the Mongols that would conquer Europe during the Middle Ages. The barbaric enemies of Rome got so much stronger. I mean, Roman military technology had more or less proliferated throughout the world. So these guys had solid imitations of Roman equipment, and they understood Roman tactics. These barbaric enemies fought in a much more disciplined fashion than those that they faced prior. I mean, so many of these barbarous peoples had served in the Roman army that, of course, they had Roman equipment and training to some extent at the very least. And these foes were simply significantly stronger than the peoples that Rome faced before. And they were far, far, far more numerous because they were migratory people that the Huns had pushed onto Roman land. So Bert is facing a humongous, humongous horde of different tribal peoples coming into their lands. Simply a tide that was impossible to stop. And speaking of enemies, Attila. Attila, simply a force to be reckoned with. You see, When had Rome really faced an enemy like Attila? Never. Truly never. I mean, even though the Parthians did fight as horse archers, just as Attila and his Huns did, they were a sedentary people. I mean, if you wanted to destroy the Parthian Empire, you knew wherever centers of power lay. You knew wherever cities were. But Attila would rove around with a seemingly endless horde of competent horse archers. And how could the Romans possibly compete with such a force when horse archers are more or less the direct counter to the Roman fighting style? I mean, can you really hide behind your shields effectively when horses are galloping around your formation, shooting arrows from every which point? Well, how do you even catch these men? The Romans were natural born horsemen. I mean, their horsemen were infamously mediocre. They weren't anything special. Therefore, how would they truly counter the Huns? Well, it proved impossible. The Romans basically had to bribe the Huns for survival, which worked aptly for the East, but for the West, it wouldn't happen. But when it came to the Huns, perhaps the greatest problem that they brought was not actually themselves, but rather the tribes that they pushed west. People like the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks. These were all migratory people that had come onto Roman lands because their lands had proved impossible to stay on because the Huns had swept through them. And that's the thing. Not only did the Huns bring themselves, which were an extremely competent opponent, but the Romans would basically prove unable to beat, but they also brought all these other people that the Romans simply did not have the resources to stop at the same time as the Huns. So this was the perfect storm aspect when it comes to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. This was the perfect storm. Just this humongous mass of different peoples coming in all at once. At the same time that the Huns came, a virtually unbeatable enemy. What were the Romans to do? I mean, they had able commanders in this era, mind you. I'm not saying that they had the greatest commanders in Roman history, but they had competent commanders. It's just which Roman general had to fight against such a force? I mean, even Marius, the great reformer of the Roman military, the man who basically created the Hollywood Romans, right? The elite and numerous Roman legionaries that I think anyone who likes this video probably, or anyone who's watching this video probably loves dearly and is very interested in. He faced like 3 German tribes simultaneously. The Huns brought way more, way higher numbers. And here's the other thing. There weren't nearly as many Romans left to oppose them, and I'll get to this now. For my next point, I want to talk about Rome's population, because the longevity of the empire does give this false impression that life in the Roman Empire was kind of similar throughout it, and that's just simply untrue. I mean, I think for a lot of people that maybe don't know Roman history that in depth, they imagine that life in like 300 BC Rome would have been similar to 280. But that's absurd. There's 500 years of difference between those two periods. And the point I really want to make is that the way that the Roman population was organized socioeconomically, quite similar to now, had changed immensely throughout Roman periods. As a precursor to what I want to explain, I'm going to talk about what happened in kind of the 1st century BC. And this actually demonstrates what happened in the late Roman Empire perfectly, because it's a very similar process. You see, during the high period of the Roman Republic, this was when Rome was fighting against the Carthaginians, the Macedonians, the Seleucids. This was basically the golden era of Rome's expansion across the Mediterranean. Rome had a lot of small, poor farmers, a lot of small-time Italian farmers who maybe had like a small plot of land. But say when, one of these farmers had a bunch of kids, those kids couldn't possibly expect to make a livable income if they all split that land equally. So some of them would go and join the army as an attempt to make money that way and perhaps climb the social ladder. And that's why in the early Roman army, in this army of the High Republic, you would have to be a landholder in order to serve. Even if you were going to serve in the lowest of the low, the velites, the lowest rank possible, you still had to own some sort of land. Although it probably would be such a small amount that you couldn't possibly live off of it. Now, by the 1st century BC, Rome had been so successful in her conquests that there was a humongous influx of slaves into the empire. So much so that it became immensely more profitable for a senator or a wealthy Roman of means to simply purchase a large plot of land and then farm it with the slaves on a grand scale. We're talking about plantation farming, similar to the type that was practiced in the American South before the Civil War. And the thing is that these large plantations became so much more efficient than these small time farms, but small time farms started to disappear. And it led to a lot of Romans flooding the large cities in search of work. It led to humongous social ills and problems. I mean, this was kind of a golden era of Roman populism where some politicians would stoke the embers of resentment against the rich in order to progress their careers. But I digress. What happened militaristically because of his movement is eventually when the Romans confronted a new threat, in this case several German tribes that had crossed the Rhine to raid into Roman territory, General Gnaeus Marius had to reform the army in order to meet these people on equal footing. And he basically got rid of a land holding requirement to join the Roman army. You now could join the Roman army if you had no land. You didn't have to have any land anymore. And of course, this was basically an acknowledgement that it's just not reasonable to expect a person that wants to join the army to own land anymore. It's going to be someone in more dire conditions, because nowadays, if you owned land, it probably meant that you were relatively well off, and you probably wouldn't want to enlist in the Roman army as a private. Now, by the time of the late Roman Empire, this crisis period, things had changed again. You see, during the reign of Diocletian, who basically created the largest bureaucracy in Rome's history and reformed the economy because of hyperinflation of copper currency, there became a big population problem when it came to recruitment. Because what Diocletian did was he basically created the prototype of feudalism. You no longer could move to whatever city you wanted and practice whatever profession you wanted. People were generationally bound to whatever professions their family had practiced. And this was in an attempt to make sure that the state would basically have like every single profession and service covered. But what it basically did was it erased the dynamic quality of the ancient world. You no longer could just move and do whatever you wanted as long as you had the means to. No, you couldn't. And this, of course, constrained drastically the amount of recruits that the Roman army had, because not everyone could go and join. And, I mean, by the time of the Western Roman Empire's collapse, you had Italian nobles preventing poor Romans from joining the army because they wanted these people working on their plantations. And because of laws, such as those passed by Diocletian, they no longer could. So there was a population problem as well as a legal problem that led to people not being able to join the Roman army. It was really only up to city dwellers to do such a thing anymore. And now my final point. Being a general in the Roman Empire kind of sucked, alright? Sure, you could sometimes cover yourself in military glory. Sometimes some jealous emperor would just make you fall on your sword. And that's the problem. because of the sheer number of civil wars, revolts, plots that happened during the Roman Empire, it was pretty hazardous to be a successful military commander. And why would you possibly wish to incentivize such a thing? I mean, by the time of the late Roman Empire, you'd think that the Romans were desperate for any type of hero, any type of person that could possibly stop the onrushing hordes of Germans trying to sack the Eternal City. Yet, clearly they weren't. And the story of General Stilicho illustrates this perfectly. You see, General Stilicho was a brilliant Roman commander, although he was half German, but he was a thoroughly Romanized person that clearly had Rome's best interests at heart. He beat Alaric several times on the open field of battle. I mean, the reason why Alaric did not sack Rome earlier than he actually did was purely because of the genius of his commander. Yet he didn't meet his end at the sword of an enemy. No, he met his end when he was ordered to commit suicide by a Roman emperor, an incompetent one who had been convinced by Italian aristocrats that this man was a threat due to his ethnicity. If Rome throws away its best generals because of, well, a very, very, very long history of betrayal and civil wars, as I mentioned. I mean, this was not a system that would operate otherwise. When you have an imperial system without established, solid traditions of succession, you do create an environment that is naturally prone to this type of upheaval and this throwing away of talent. Yet, such a system simply could not persist. It could not continue without it being fixed, and nobody ever fixed it. I mean, even Belisarius, right, the person who, at least for a generation, basically reconquered the Western Roman Empire in the 7th century AD, he was imprisoned. He was imprisoned by Emperor Justinian. Again, because Justinian was jealous. And this was a persistent problem that clearly was not going to go anywhere. But it was ruinous. For if you throw away your best generals, eventually, once your enemies get strong enough, they will take you out. And that's precisely what happened to the Western Roman Empire. So, here are my talking points on why the Roman Empire collapsed. And I feel that together they create a pretty succinct argument on why the empire collapsed. Are you convinced? Well, let me know in the comment section, for I love both agreement and a good counter argument. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.